Hey everybody out there in YouTube land. Today I'm going to be talking to you about everything you need to know about bleed through. If you're a furniture flipper or just a furniture painter, or you ever paint anything wood, you may have heard the term thrown around tannins, or tannins seeping through or bleed through, needing to use some kind of primer or a stain blocking primer to prep your surfaces, and you may be wondering what all that means and what it's all about. So today I'm going to talk about if you are painting something wood, whether it's been painted before or hasn't been painted before, what is bleed through, what can you do to stop it, what causes it, what can you do if it's already happened to fix it, and more importantly, what can you do to prevent it from happening in the first place and save yourself a lot of time and trouble. Just quickly before I dive into that, I do want to invite you to look in the description box below and click on the link to get my free Furniture Flippers pricing worksheet if you are somebody who likes to fix up furniture and then resell it. That pricing worksheet just helps you work through how much you're going to ask for each piece or how much you can afford to pay for a piece in order to get the amount of profit that you're hoping to in the end. It just helps you kind of work through the processes of your expenses and your time and come to a good idea about how much you could make off that piece and whether it's going to be worth it to do that or not. So grab that in the description box below if you ever do like to sell furniture. Okay, so bleed through. Cue horror music. This is a reenactment of anybody who has experienced bleed through on a piece that they already finished painting and thought they were done with, and they come back to it and it has this weird, ugly stuff seeping through it. What is bleed through? I hear a lot of people talk about the tannins in the wood, needing to block tannins because tannins bleed through. That's true. Tannins are these, fluids or colored things in the woods that can come to the surface and they can come through your paint. It can happen very quickly or it can happen after a long time. Sometimes it takes quite a while for the tannins to work their way through. Now, what I always called it, down here in Texas we have a lot of pine furniture, and I would call it sap, or some people would call it resin. And it's coming through mostly from like knot holes and places like that, and so I always called it the sap bleed through. But it's kind of the same thing. Whatever word you use, it's the stuff inside the wood that's colored working its way out to the top surface and ruining your paint job. But other things can bleed through too, and so it's worth mentioning. There's plenty of other things that can bleed through. It could be some ink from a pen. It could be permanent marker, maybe nail polish that was on something, and if you don't clean something well enough, something you can't even see, if you have a piece of furniture and someone spilled a Coke on that in 1985 and it got down in the cracks and edges of the legs of the table, then it may come back to haunt you as these splatters and weird brown marks that come back up through your paint. And so there are a lot of different things that can work their way back up and ruin your paint job. And so you do want to know what they are and how to prevent them and how to block them so that they won't mess up all the work that you've done. Another thing that can seep up through the wood is the stain itself, not just the color of the wood or the wood sap, but the stain that someone put on top of it, because those stains have pigments in them. And particularly the older ones, the older the pieces and the longer ago the stain was made, the less likely it is to have been kind of our modern manufactured, really stable types of stains that we usually see today. So an old piece that's stained, especially with a real reddish kind of finish, it's quite likely that those pigments in the stain may push their way to the top very quickly and ruin your paint job. In fact, I want to shout out to a YouTube friend, Coach Chick Heather Jordan. If you guys have not checked her out, she flips furniture, and I'm going to link below to a video that she did where she had an old piece and the stain itself bled through and caused it to turn pink. Luckily she was smart enough that she did 3 little samples of primer before she painted the piece, and the next day she went in and 2 of them had turned bright pink from that red stain seeping through, and 1 of them still looked good. So that was very smart of her to do that before she spent all that time priming it. But the older the pieces, the more likely that the stain or something like that is going to be able to bleed through if you don't block it properly. Sometimes people ask, is this just not enough coats of paint, or is this bleed through coming through? And the difference is, if you're painting something a light color, it may take a lot more coats of paint than you think to really get it white or the light color you want, and without seeing some of the darker furniture still coming through. And even when you put on the paint, the second or third coat, you think it's enough, and you come back after it dries and it's still not as bright white as you expected it to be. That just means you need more coverage. What we're talking about is bleed through, and bleed through is more like, to use another horror analogy here, It's like a zombie. You think it was buried, it was under there, you covered it up, it wasn't showing, the paint dried, we thought it was all buried, and then eventually it comes back, it returns from the grave to haunt you. So it's more like a zombie patch of something coming back up through the paint that you put on that wasn't there before. That's what bleed through is. And like I said, it can happen quickly or it can take quite a while. If you have never experienced bleed through and you flipped some furniture or painted some furniture and sold it, and especially if you work real quickly and get it out the door fast, let's hope that the person you sold it to has not experienced bleed through, because sometimes it can take a few months to even show up. And so it's good for you to know what causes it and what to do to prevent it. And also, more importantly, like, when are you most likely to need to do something to prevent it, so that you're not wasting your time necessarily doing unnecessary steps, but that you are going to use some kind of blocking primer on the times when it's most likely to have bleed through problems. And that way your customers will be happy and they won't have all this weird stuff showing up later after they bought something from you. I'm going to cut to the chase here for those of you who don't have time to watch the whole video. I would love for you to watch the whole video, because I'm going to talk about the reasons why it happens, the biggest offenders, like which things are and which woods are most likely to cause bleed through. But I'm going to very quickly give you a preview of the answer of what you need to do about it in case you are in a big hurry. And the short answer is shellac. Anything with shellac in it is the stuff that is best to block all those tannins and sap and things that tend to bleed through. There are other blocking primers, particularly oil-based primers, that can cut it and stop it sometimes. But if you're having tannin or sap bleed through, particularly for that, the shellac-based stuff, it creates a barrier that it can't get through. It's kind of a hard, shiny surface, and the tannins can't get through that. And so this is your safest thing to use. Now here, like I said, I'm in Texas. I paint a lot of pine furniture, and a lot of times it's just certain areas like knot holes and a few places where the wood is darker, that those are the places that bleed through. The lighter parts of wood usually don't do it. And so I do a lot of spot blocking, where I would use a spray shellac like this just on the places where I think it's going to bleed through. And so this is something you can use. Also, this is great for fixing it if you do find bleed through, like just in certain places, like some ink or something that got spilled. This is a good thing to use after the fact, after you've already put on a coat or two and then something starts popping up. You can use this. And then there are primers made with shellac that you can use to prime the whole thing. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the short answer is find something with shellac and that should protect it. So let's talk about who the biggest offenders are for having tannin or sap or resin bleed through. And what I would love is for those of you who have experienced this and live in different parts of the country or world than I do, to please jump in here in the comments and give us all advice on what you've experienced, what problems, which woods or stains are the worst or the best, because this is a group project. We're all here to help each other, so I would love to hear what you guys have experienced. So the biggest offenders, typically redwoods. They have this red color inside them naturally that comes out. So literally redwood or mahogany or cherry, all those woods have a red color naturally to them. So they have tannins that are typically likely to come through when you're painting something light colored or white and turn it like a pinkish or reddish color. You've really got to be careful with those. Very often the stains that they will use on top of those reddish colored woods are also reddish colored to kind of even enhance that reddish color of the wood. And so red looking stains, as I said before, the older the piece is, the more likely that stain is to have some pigments that may transfer and come through your paint. The thing about red pigments in general is that they are the least stable colors. And it's true even in nature, they're the most likely to work their way up to the surface. I mean, you guys all know this just in practicality, that if a red sock gets in your white laundry, it's going to turn everything pink far more likely than if, you know, some other color, a green one or a yellow one or something. The red is just usually the worst offender, and that's because red dyes and pigments, they are the most transient, they're the least stable. They're often the colors that fade the fastest, and that's why when you're buying artist pigments like paints, a lot of times the reds are the most expensive paints to buy, because they're just the trickiest and they're the least stable colors. So remember that when you're working with anything with reds, they are more likely to kind of bleed through your paint than other colors. But I work with pine a lot, and it's usually what we call yellow pine here in Texas. There's also something called knotty pine. There's white pine, which will be a little lighter, but it still will have sometimes some of these same qualities. And what I found in the pine is that It will have knot holes, and it also sometimes have dark parts of the wood, and those will bleed through. Typically it will be a brown or a yellow color that bleeds through, not red, because that's what color the sap or the tannins are. And so it's not as dark or as obvious sometimes, but certainly if there's, I'll try and find, I think I've got some video of some that I've just even seen at a thrift store where it's clearly a pine piece that after years has had like every knot hole has bled through, and you can see all the knot holes in it. And that's what we see down here a lot more in Texas. And for those things, you can kind of spot treat it instead of treating it all over. But if there's a piece of the wood that's darker than the rest, you'll sometimes get an entire, like a whole stripe from a whole strip of wood that also gets darker. So you may want to treat the whole thing just to be safe. So like I said, one of the other big offenders is just stuff that got on the top of your furniture, not from the tannins themselves, but things like ink or food that spilled on it. And that's why cleaning, the first step of cleaning with a good degreaser and cleaning real thoroughly, is one of the first things you can do to prevent having problems. This is the biggest problem I tend to have, because sometimes I get a little lazy when I think I'm through cleaning everything and there's some one part of one leg that I didn't get to, and then I'll find something pop back up that has food or some old thing, dirt that was spilled on it that I didn't get cleaned off, because I'm pretty good at anticipating where the tannins are going to bleed through or which woods are going to be a problem. But you never know where something's been spilled on a dark piece of furniture that you can't see, and then when you try and paint it white, those things pop back up. And so cleaning with something like Crud Cutter or TSP, or there are more natural green substitutes for that, all of those things that are degreasers will help take off those things that you can't even see that are going to end up bleeding through and making your project take longer. So it's very important to clean it in the first place. Follow the directions and wash it, clean it back off if you need to after you put one of those fairly harsh cleansers on, but make sure that you're using something like that to clean it with, and that will eliminate a lot of your problems that are things that have just built up over time that can cause problems. Now here's something that's a little bit counterintuitive. We talk about how stain can bleed through, but one of the things that will help you is if something has a modern day clear factory finish on it, if you don't break all the way through it to the stain layer or to the wood layer, that factory finish of clear coat will help block the tannins from coming through. And so if you're sanding something, sometimes you have to sand through that whole layer to get out some deep scratches or scuffs, but if you don't have to and you can just scuff sand the top enough to give it some tooth to take your primer, then try not to go break through that top layer of sealant, because if you break down to the stain or to the wood, then the tannins can get out. And if you keep that factory finish on there, that will stop them usually pretty well. And so you won't necessarily have to use a primer if you have a nice factory clear coat on top and you just scuff through the very top of it, the top layer of it. So the basic way to prep a dark piece of furniture that you're concerned will have bleed through, to paint a light color, which is something we a lot of times want to do now to make it have a modern, fresh feel, is first clean it very well with some kind of TSP or the equivalent type of cleaner. Then give it a very light scuff sanding to create some tooth for the paint to stick to. Wipe that down, then paint it with a primer, a shellac based primer if you want to be sure that you're blocking the tannins. That can be a shellac based primer, or it can just be sprayed with some shellac itself. You can't clean that up with water, so when you put it on, you usually want to use one of your crummy brushes that you're willing to sacrifice, or a little roller that you're willing to throw away. And I recommend that you do, if you can, do several different pieces at one time, because while you got that stuff on your brush and it's stinky and it's not that fun to work with, just get everything out of the way that you can that you're going to be needing to paint at that time if possible. Then once that's dry, you're going to lightly sand that again, particularly if you're just doing some spot shellacking. That stuff is very shiny, and you do need to sand it down a little bit because it will make a shiny surface, and when you paint on top of that, it can cause your paint to crackle. What causes crackle is when there's a kind of a slick surface with then a more chalky dry paint on top. When that paint dries, it cracks because the stuff underneath is slippery and it can't stick to it well enough. And so you can accidentally cause crackle glazing if you put this shellac on very heavy. You need to give that a little tooth by sanding it, and don't put it on real heavy or you'll get some drips too, which will show up. You'll be able to see the drips behind the paint, so you don't want that. Once you've gently sanded your shellac or your shellac based primer and wiped that down again, then you're ready to go ahead with your paint. The good news is if you're painting something from dark to white, you might as well use the white primer because it's cheaper than chalk paint typically. You're going to need fewer coats of white paint if you put on the white primer first, and it will do the added benefit of blocking the tannins or any other stuff and just keep you from having problems. So if you're going from dark to white, I think it's a great idea to use the white primer. A couple coats of that, or even just one if that's all you have time for, will still help get it brighter, and it will help block some of the stuff coming through. And then you move on to painting with your white or light colored paint. You will have to not do as many coats of that. You'll probably still have to do like 2 coats of primer and at least 2 coats of white paint in order to get that really bright white finish. But if you weren't using the primer, you would have to probably do 4 coats of white paint. I mean, it takes a lot to get something really dark to go into completely white with a white paint. It takes a while to get that coverage. Even with chalk paint and things that have good coverage, it takes several coats. I see a lot of YouTubers out there who are flipping furniture who just, as a matter of course, use the Ben shellac based primer on everything they do before they put the paint on. And I certainly can understand why. Once you've been burned a few times after doing all this work and then had it get ruined with the bleed through and had to do it over again, I can see why you would say, that's it, from now on my method just includes using the primer. Better safe than sorry, I won't ever have this problem again. And like I said, if you're painting something white, I would say why not? Why wouldn't you do that? If you're painting something a dark color, and if you do more of a farmhouse or distressed type finish, or you're doing things to kind of look like folk art or primitive, just remember that if you're going to sand through or take off any of that paint, you're going to see the white layer. You're going to be able to see that primer layer, and that may not be what you want. So keep that in mind. You also, if you're painting in a darker color, you probably don't need the white primer as much because bleed through is not as much of a problem. If you have something that you think is highly likely to bleed through and you're painting it in a color and you do want to distress it but you don't want to see white paint underneath coming through, then keep in mind that you can do a tinted primer. Now it depends on where you get it, what brand it is and things like that, but you go to the hardware store like Home Depot, there are primers that they have. It may not be a shellac based one, but you can probably get a good enough one that it'll work for you. And then you can have it tinted to the same color as the paint you're going to paint. And that really is the safest way. If you're taking something to a particular color over a dark base, using a primer that's tinted in the same color as your paint is actually technically the best way to get the exact color you really want it to be when you're finished. So that's always an option. You can use a tinted primer. They even have primers that are gray. That's just a typical primer color that you can find sometimes off the shelf. And a gray primer, which is a mid-value primer, is going to probably work better underneath a dark color if you're painting in a darker or even a medium color. The gray will help you get to that mid color instead of white. When you have that, if you go from dark to white and then you try and come back to a darker color, again, you're going to kind of need more coats to get back to the color that you want. So just keep all that in mind. Okay, just to show you these products that I'm recommending, what I'm talking about let me grab it. I just have a big one right now. I don't have a little one. The Ben primer right here is the shellac based primer, and that definitely will protect your piece of furniture from pretty much anything. And what I recommend putting it on with is something like this, just a foam brush. This gets it smooth, so this is what you should use anytime if you're going to paint your kitchen cabinets or something like that, or woodwork where you want it to be really smooth. One of these high density foam rollers will get the smoothest paint finish. So use something like this and then wrap it up and keep it for next time if you can. If it dries up, just go ahead and throw it away because they're hard to clean up. So just to recap, you can just decide that you're going to paint everything with a shellac based primer to make sure that you don't ever have problems with bleed through, but I think that it's advisable to do it on the times when you're most likely to need it and most likely to have bleed through, and you are less likely to need to do it if the following things are true. So just keep these in mind. The newer a piece is, the lighter the wood is, the body of the wood that it's made out of. Things like, things like maple and birch and beech. Those things typically are not as likely to have bleed through or have problems with the tannins. Again, you guys, please throw in the comments here from your experience with different types of woods. I'm just going off the top of my head from years of painting things, and I'm not a wood specialist, so chime in, please. The lighter the stain is, if the stain itself originally is a lighter color of stain and less red, then you're less likely to need probably to do a stain blocking primer. Also, the thicker the factory clear coat is, then the less that you had to break through it. If you're just scuffing it up but you're keeping that clear coat on and using some kind of high bonding paint on top, then you're less likely to probably need to do it. And then finally, the darker the color is that you're gonna paint it, the less likely you are to need that, because darker colors, I mean, if you're painting something black or dark gray, you're probably not really gonna see bleed through on a color like that. So I don't think you necessarily are gonna need to do that primer, but you are gonna need to do something to make sure your paint will really adhere well. In which case, make sure that scuff sanding is really good and the cleaning with a degreaser or a deglosser is really good, so that you have something that your paint can stick to. That'll be important. Okay, I'd love to hear any horror stories about bleed through, any questions, anything that you have to say that you have learned that you would love to share with us. I'd love to hear that in the comments, so please let me know. And I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel if you like the topics of furniture painting, furniture flipping, and mural painting. Those are the kinds of things I talk about a lot on this channel. Thanks a lot.